She arrived with a fortune in stolen money to marry a man she'd never met, but instead of a wedding, she found a smoking ruin and a murder. The autumn wind carried the bitter smell of charred wood across the Colorado plains as Catherine Whitmore stepped down from the stagecoach. Her silk gloves, a world away from this dust-choked landscape, clutched a leather satchel. Inside that satchel was $47,000, more money than anyone in this dying frontier town would ever see. It was her secret, her burden, and her only hope for survival. She had traveled 800 miles from Boston to marry a man named Thomas Brennan, a man she knew only from letters and a faded photograph. She was running from her father's crimes, from powerful men who would stop at nothing to get their money back. This marriage was meant to be her escape, a new name, a new life. But the homestead she'd been promised was gone. Blackened timbers clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the ghost of a fire that had consumed everything. And the man waiting for her wasn't the handsome, prosperous rancher from the letters. He was a one-armed blacksmith named Samuel Hayes. He stood amidst the ruins, his shoulders slumped, his eyes holding a world of pain. He looked at her fancy dress, at her pristine gloves, and then at the satchel in her hand. And in that moment, Catherine knew her carefully laid plans had just gone up in smoke, just like the home she was supposed to inherit. What she didn't know was that the fire was just the beginning. Her arrival was about to ignite a war in the heart of this small town, a war of justice and greed, of redemption and revenge. And it all started with a single, devastating lie. Before we dive into the heart of this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe that one person can make a difference even against impossible odds, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The October sun hung low as the stagecoach had rattled towards Cedar Ridge. Catherine pressed her face against the window, watching the endless prairie grass roll by. At 26, she was the picture of Boston high society. Perfect hair, intelligent green eyes, and a posture that spoke of privilege. But it was all a mask. Beneath the silk and wool was a desperate woman on the run. The $47,000 at her feet was her late father's hidden fortune. Harrison Whitmore had been a respected banker, or so the world thought. In private, he was a master of corruption, skimming vast sums from railroad deals with men who did not forgive or forget. His sudden heart attack had left Catherine with a terrifying choice: expose his crimes and be destroyed by the scandal, or vanish before his partners came looking for their missing fortune. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like a sign from God. Thomas Brennan's letters painted a picture of a paradise on the frontier, a thriving cattle town, a successful ranch, and a man who wanted a partner as much as a wife. He needed her education, her refinement, and her capital. It was the perfect cover, a way to launder her father's dirty money into something clean, something real. Now, standing in front of Murphy's Hotel, the reality of Cedar Ridge hit her. It was small, dusty, and every single person on the street had stopped to stare at her. The fancy lady from the East, Thomas Brennan's bride, a tall woman with work-worn hands and a worried face, approached her. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Martha Murphy. I own the hotel. We need to speak, privately." The dread in Martha's voice was a cold hand gripping Catherine's heart. She followed her into the hotel lobby, the satchel suddenly feeling like it was filled with lead. "Mrs. Whitmore," Martha began, her voice gentle, "there's been an accident." Catherine's mind raced. Had he discovered her secret? Did he know about the money? "Thomas Brennan is dead," Martha said. "He died 3 weeks ago. There was a fire at his ranch." The words didn't register at first. Dead? Her escape plan? Her future husband? Her entire new life? Gone? "His last letter," Catherine stammered, sinking into a chair. "He was planning our wedding." "He was a good man," Martha said, her face creased with sympathy. "The whole town mourned him. He was so excited for you to arrive, telling everyone about his educated bride from Boston." Stranded. That was the only word Catherine could think of. She was stranded in a strange town with no one to turn to, and a fortune that belonged to very dangerous men. "His property?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "His cattle?" "That's where it gets complicated," Martha said, glancing out the window. Tom had debts, more than anyone knew. When he died, the creditors moved fast. The bank took the land. The cattle were sold off to pay what he owed. To BQ, he was broke. The prosperous rancher was a fantasy. She had traveled 800 miles to marry a bankrupt man who was now dead. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. Through the window, Catherine saw him approaching, the one-armed blacksmith from the ruins. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that was handsome, but etched with grief. His left sleeve was pinned neatly at the shoulder. "That's Samuel Hayes," Martha said. He was Tom's best friend, his partner. Samuel pushed through the hotel doors, bringing the smell of smoke and sweat with him. He stopped short when he saw Catherine. His dark eyes took in her expensive dress, her shocked expression. "You must be Catherine Whitmore," he said. His voice was quiet with a hint of an Irish accent. "Tom, he talked about you all the time." "Mr. Hayes," Catherine said, forcing herself to stand, "I've just been informed." "It means you've traveled a long way for nothing," Samuel said, his words blunt, direct. Tom's dreams died in that fire. His honesty was jarring, so different from the polite lies of Boston society. She needed that honesty. She needed to know everything. "You were his partner?" she asked. "What happened?" Samuel's expression darkened. Tom had big plans. Too big. He borrowed from every bank in the territory, convinced the railroad was coming, and cattle prices would soar. "And when the railroad was delayed?" Catherine asked, already knowing the answer. "Prices collapsed. He was ruined. The fire just made it final." Samuel's gaze was intense, analytical. He wasn't just looking at her, he was studying her. "Tom mentioned you were bringing investment capital." Catherine's mind raced. She couldn't reveal the truth. "Not yet. I have some savings." Samuel's eyes flickered to her silk gloves, to the pearl earrings she wore. A small, humorless smile touched his lips. "Ma'am, forgive me for being direct, but that dress you're wearing cost more than most folks here make in a year." "Some savings" seems like an understatement. He was sharp, sharper than she'd expected. The heat rose in her cheeks. She had underestimated the one-armed blacksmith. That was a mistake she couldn't afford to make again. "My father left me comfortable," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Comfortable enough to do what?" he pressed. "Tom's land is gone. His name is Mud. What were you planning to build here?" The question sparked something in her. Not anger, but a challenge. "I was planning to build a future, Mr. Hayes. A place where I could use my mind and my resources to create something lasting." She met his gaze, her chin held high. "And now I'm a woman alone in a town where I know no one, where the man I came to marry is dead, and his dream is in ashes. What would you do in my situation, Mr. Hayes?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. He seemed to be weighing not just her words, but the truth hidden behind them. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "If I were you," he said, "I'd be honest. Because in a town this small, secrets have a way of getting people killed." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And from the looks of it, you're carrying the biggest secret Cedar Ridge has ever seen." Catherine's blood ran cold. He knew. He didn't know the details, but he knew she was in trouble. The kind of trouble that didn't just follow you, it hunted you down. Martha Murphy refilled their coffee cups, her hand trembling slightly. The air in the small hotel lobby was thick with unspoken questions. "Sam's right," Martha said, her voice hushed. "We're good people here, but we don't take kindly to folks who aren't straight with us." Catherine felt like she was standing on a cliff's edge. She could lie, try to maintain her cover, and remain an outsider, vulnerable and alone. Or she could take a leap of faith and trust these two strangers with a piece of the truth. "You're right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I have more than savings. Substantially more." Samuel's expression didn't change. He just waited. "How much more?" She took a deep breath. "Enough to buy back Tom's land from the bank. Enough to restock his entire herd. Enough to build everything he dreamed of, and then some." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Martha let out a shaky breath. Samuel stared at her, a new sharp-edged wariness in his eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, he said slowly, deliberately, that kind of money doesn't travel in a lady's satchel without a story attached. A story that usually involves banks, lawyers, or federal marshals. He was perceptive, dangerously so. My circumstances are unusual, she said, the understatement of the century. Unusual how? He pressed, relentless. This was it, the moment of truth. Her answer would decide everything. The kind of circumstances, she said, meeting his gaze, that require a person to disappear from their old life completely. Samuel set his coffee cup down with a quiet thud. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. For a long moment, he just watched the dusty street. When he turned back, his face was a grim mask. Ma'am, in my experience, and he said, his voice flat and cold, when a person with a bag full of cash needs to disappear, it's for one of two reasons: crime or scandal. He took a step closer, his eyes boring into hers. You don't look like a bank robber, so that leaves scandal. What did you do? The accusation, so direct and unapologetic, was like a slap in the face. But she couldn't afford to be offended. He was right. It wasn't me, she said, her voice shaking slightly. It was my father. She told them a carefully edited version of the truth. A story of a respected banker, a hidden life of corruption, and a daughter left to clean up the mess. She told them about powerful men, stolen fortunes, and the need to start over where no one could find her. She left out the part where the money in her bag was the very fortune those men were hunting for. When she finished, Martha looked horrified. Samuel, however, looked something else. He looked interested. So the money isn't legally your, he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Technically, she admitted, it belongs to men who would use it to destroy more lives. I want to use it to build something. Money has to be cleaned, Samuel said, the words sounding strange coming from a simple blacksmith. Washed through legitimate businesses so it can't be traced back to its source. He was pacing now, the energy in the small room becoming more intense with every step. You're talking about laundering. I'm talking about redemption, she shot back. For the money and for me. Samuel stopped pacing and stared at her, a strange light dawning in his eyes. It was a look of dawning, terrifying possibility. How much? He asked again, his voice urgent. Exactly how much are we talking about? $47,000, she whispered. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sweet Jesus, she breathed. That's more money than this whole town sees in 5 years. Samuel's eyes went wide just for a second. The blacksmith, the grieving friend, disappeared. In his place was a shrewd, calculating businessman. His mind was working, the gears turning at a furious pace. 47,000, he murmured. That could do it. It could actually do it. Do what? Catherine asked. Save this town, he said, his voice filled with a sudden, fierce passion. He gestured out the window. Look at it, Mrs. Whitmore. We're dying. The railroad went south. The cattle market collapsed. Tom's failure wasn't just his own. It was a symptom. This town is on life support. He turned to her, his one hand clenched into a fist. You have the capital. I have the knowledge. I know this land, these people, the opportunities. Tom's mistake wasn't his dream. It was his lack of resources. He tried to build an empire on borrowed money. We can do it with real capital. The idea was insane. A partnership with this stranger, a one-armed blacksmith she'd met less than an hour ago. But what choice did she have? What kind of partnership? She asked, her voice wary. 50-50, he said without hesitation. You provide the money, I provide the management, the labor, the local expertise. We make all major decisions together. We buy back Tom's land. We rebuild, we diversify. A sawmill, a grain mill, investments in mining. We create an economy so strong, the railroad will have to come to us. He was offering her exactly what she'd hoped to find with Thomas Brennan. Not just a marriage of convenience, but a true business partnership, and a way to make her dirty money clean. But the risk? How do I know I can trust you? She asked. How do I know you won't just take my money and disappear? Samuel looked from her to Martha, then back again. You don't, he said simply. And I don't know if I can trust you. All we have is this moment. A dying town, a woman on the run with a fortune, and a man who's tired of watching his friend's dreams turn to ash. He extended his hand, his one calloused, work-hardened hand. We can save this town, Mrs. Whitmore, together. But we have to decide, right here, right now. Are you in? Her heart was pounding. This was madness. She was about to entrust her entire future, her very life, to this intense, one-armed stranger. But looking into his eyes, she saw not just ambition, but a deep, burning integrity and desperation, the same desperation she felt. She took his hand. It was warm and strong. I'm in, she said, partners. A wave of relief washed over Samuel's face, so profound it was startling. It was the look of a man who had just been pulled back from the brink. But as they stood there, their hands clasped in a silent agreement, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder on the street outside. 3 riders, moving with an unnerving confidence, pulled up in front of the hotel. The man in the lead was dressed in a fine suit that looked out of place in the dusty town. He sat on a magnificent black stallion, looking down at the world as if he owned it. Martha Murphy's face went pale. Oh, no. Samuel's hand dropped from Catherine's. His entire body went rigid. The hope that had been in his eyes moments before was replaced by a cold, hard dread. Who is that? Catherine asked, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. Samuel's voice was a low, dangerous growl. That, he said, is the man who really owned Thomas Brennan, the man who owns this entire valley. That's Gerald Morrison. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Gerald Morrison dismounted, his expensive boots kicking up dust. He moved with the predatory grace of a wolf, his cold eyes scanning the street before settling on the hotel. His 2 companions remained on their horses, their hands resting casually on their holstered pistols. They weren't cowboys, they were guards. Stay here, Samuel said to Catherine, his voice low and urgent. He moved to block the doorway, his body a shield between her and the approaching men. Mr. Hayes, Morrison called out, his voice smooth and cultured, but with an undercurrent of steel. A word, if you please. Morrison stepped onto the hotel porch, his gaze flicking past Samuel and locking onto Catherine. He assessed her in a single, sweeping glance. The dress, the jewelry, the bearing of a woman of wealth. A flicker of something, curiosity, calculation, crossed his face. And who is this? Morrison asked, his smile not reaching his eyes. This is Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, Samuel said, his tone clipped. She was engaged to Tom Brennan. Ah, the mail-order bride, Morrison said, the words dripping with condescension. My deepest condolences on your loss, Mrs. Whitmore, and on your wasted journey. Tom was a good man, but a terrible businessman. His affairs were a mess. Catherine felt a surge of anger. This man was talking about her intended husband, a man he supposedly respected, with cold, dismissive contempt. She stepped out from behind Samuel, channeling every ounce of the icy composure she'd learned in Boston's drawing rooms. Mr. Morrison, she said, her voice clear and steady, it is a tragedy. Thomas wrote so glowingly of his prospects here. It's a shock to learn his entire operation was built on a foundation of debt. Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a woman. Tom was a dreamer. This land requires realists. His property, what's left of it, has been sold to settle his accounts. Sold to whom? Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer. To me, of course, Morrison said with a dismissive wave of his hand. I've absorbed his debts and taken control of the land. It's the most efficient solution. I was just riding out to inspect my new acquisition. He had picked the bones of Tom's dream before his body was even cold. That land wasn't yours to take, Samuel growled. Tom had other partners, other options. Did he? Morrison's gaze was sharp as a shard of glass. His books showed no other partners, only debt, mountains of it, owed, as it happens, mostly to my bank. It was a stranglehold, a web of debt so complete that Morrison had owned Tom long before the fire. The fire had just been a convenient way to foreclose. Catherine's mind was spinning. This wasn't just a business rival. This was a predator who had systematically dismantled Tom's life. Mr. Morrison, she said, testing the waters, I understand you are the most significant landowner in the valley. As an investor new to the area, I'd be interested to learn more about your operations. The words investor and new to the area hung in the air. It was a subtle declaration. I am not leaving. I have money, and I am a threat. Morrison understood her meaning perfectly. His cordial mask slipped just for a second, revealing the cold ruthlessness beneath. This valley has a delicate economy, Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice dropping. It doesn't respond well to outside interference. People who don't understand the way things work here often find themselves in unfortunate situations, like poor Tom. It was a threat, wrapped in a thin veil of concern. Samuel stepped forward. Are you saying the fire wasn't an accident, Morrison? Morrison laughed, a short, ugly sound. Fires happen, Hayes. Kerosene lamps get knocked over. Barns full of dry hay go up in a flash. It's a tragedy, nothing more. He turned his attention back to Catherine, his eyes lingering on the satchel she still held at her side. You, however, seem to be a woman of resources, he said smoothly. Cedar Ridge is a small town. It has no room for grand ambitions that conflict with the established order. I trust you'll make a wise decision and take the next stagecoach back to wherever you came from. He was telling her to run, and in that moment, Catherine Whitmore made a decision. She had not run 800 miles from one group of powerful criminals just to be chased away by another. Actually, Mr. Morrison, she said, a polite, dangerous smile on her face, I've just entered into a business partnership with Mr. Hayes. We have plans to invest quite heavily in the future of Cedar Ridge. The air crackled with tension. Morrison's smile vanished completely. His eyes were chips of ice. Samuel shot Catherine a look that was a mixture of terror and awe. Is that so? Morrison said, his voice dangerously soft. You and the one-armed blacksmith? He looked at Samuel's pinned-up sleeve with open contempt. A bold venture. I wish you all the luck you will so desperately need. He turned without another word and swung himself onto his horse. But before he rode away, he looked back at Catherine, his face a mask of cold fury. A word of advice, Mrs. Whitmore, he called out. Around here, we have a saying. Don't play with fire. You might get burned. He spurred his horse and galloped away, his men falling in behind him, leaving a cloud of dust and a chilling silence in their wake. Catherine's legs suddenly felt weak. She gripped the porch railing for support, her knuckles white. What have I done? She whispered. Samuel was staring after Morrison, his face grim. You've just declared war. He turned to her, his expression a mixture of fear and a strange, newfound respect. Are you insane? He killed him, she said, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. That fire was no accident. Morrison killed Thomas Brennan. I know, Samuel said quietly. You know? She asked, shocked. And you let him get away with it. Let him? Samuel's voice was bitter. Catherine, look around you. Morrison owns the sheriff. He owns the judge. He owns the bank. He is the law in this valley. Accusing him of murder is a death sentence. And he just threatened to sign ours. The full, terrifying scope of her situation was finally clear. She was trapped in a town run by a murderer, and she had just announced her intention to become his direct competitor. She looked at Samuel, at the hard lines of his face, at the coiled tension in his body. She thought of Tom Brennan, the man she'd never met, burned alive for his dream. And she thought of the stolen money in her bag. It was tainted. It was born of crime. But maybe, just maybe, it could be used for justice. He doesn't own us, Samuel, she said, her voice filled with a resolve she didn't know she possessed. He may own this town, but he doesn't own us. Samuel looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw not just a frightened socialite from Boston, but a woman made of steel. He will try to crush us, Samuel warned. He'll use every tool he has. Intimidation, sabotage, violence. Then we will have to be smarter, she said. We'll have to be more ruthless. She looked down at her silk gloves, so clean and out of place. She pulled them off finger by finger and tossed them into the dust of the street. It was a symbolic act. The Boston lady was gone. He made one mistake, Samuel, she said, looking up at him, her green eyes blazing. What's that? He underestimated us. She gestured from herself to him. The frightened woman and the one-armed blacksmith. A grim smile touched her lips. He has no idea who he's dealing with. That night, in the back room of Samuel's forge, the air thick with the smell of coal and iron, they laid their plans. The glow from the banked furnace cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the small space feel like a conspirator's den. A hand-drawn map of Cedar Ridge County was spread across a workbench, held down by heavy hammers. It was a map of Morrison's empire. He started here, Samuel said, his finger tapping a large parcel of land in the center of the valley. His family's original homestead. From there, he expanded, like a disease. His finger traced a web of acquisitions. A small ranch foreclosed on by the bank. A farm sold after a mysterious crop failure. A business that went bankrupt after its supply lines were suddenly cut. And then, his finger stopped on the blackened square that had been Tom's ranch. Tom's land was the key, Samuel said, his voice tight. It has the best water rights in the entire valley. Without it, Morrison couldn't expand south. Tom refused to sell. He knew what Morrison was. So Morrison had him killed, Catherine finished, her voice cold, and made it look like an accident caused by his own financial desperation, Samuel added. It was the perfect crime. No one dared to question it. Catherine studied the map, her mind working furiously. She was starting to see the pattern, the same cold, predatory logic her own father had used to build his corrupt empire in Boston. It was all about control. Control of resources, control of finances, and control of the law. We can't fight him on his terms, she said, thinking aloud. We can't outbid him for land or overpower him with force. He controls the board. So we need to change the game, Samuel said, catching her train of thought. Exactly. She looked up at him. Samuel, you said he owns the local sheriff, the local judge. But who doesn't he own? Samuel thought for a moment. The federal government? He offered, though it sounded more like a question than an answer. The territory marshals? But they're 100 miles away in Denver. They don't get involved in local property disputes. This isn't a property dispute, Catherine said, a spark of an idea igniting in her mind. It's a criminal conspiracy. My father, he taught me things. Not intentionally, but I listened. I learned how men like him, men like Morrison, operate. They create a closed system where they are the law. The only way to beat them is to bring in a higher authority they can't control. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. They would gather evidence, build a case, and deliver it to the U.S. Marshals in Denver. They would bypass Morrison's corrupt local empire and bring the full weight of federal law down on his head. Evidence? Samuel said, the skepticism clear in his voice. Catherine, people are terrified of him. No one will testify. It would be their word against the richest, most powerful man in the territory. Then we need more than testimony, she said. Her mind was racing now, connecting the dots. We need proof, something undeniable, something that makes this a federal crime, not a local one. She thought about the supply lines being cut, the mail that must have been involved, letters from banks, from suppliers, from family. The mail, she whispered. Samuel, does Morrison have any connection to the Postal Service? The depot agent? Samuel's eyes widened in understanding. The depot agent is a man named Albert, a quiet man, easily intimidated. He's been there for years. If anyone knows about mail being mishandled, it would be him. Then that's where we start, Catherine declared. We find a federal crime, mail fraud, interference with interstate commerce, something that will force the marshals to listen. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only move they had. Samuel was quiet for a long time, studying her face in the firelight. The intensity of his gaze made her feel exposed, as if he could see right through her carefully constructed walls, right down to the fear and desperation that drove her. You know, he said slowly, when you first stepped off that stagecoach, I thought you were just another rich city girl who was going to be eaten alive out here. I still might be, she admitted. No, he said, shaking his head. No, you won't be. He paused, and a question that had been hanging in the air since they met finally surfaced. He looked down at his pinned-up sleeve. Does this bother you? The question was so direct, so vulnerable, it caught her off guard. Your arm? No, of course not. Why would it? He looked away, his jaw tight. It was a ranching accident, years ago. A piece of machinery. She could tell he was lying, or at least not telling her the whole truth. But she didn't push. They had a long night ahead of them, and a war to plan. There would be time for personal histories later, if they survived. Samuel, she said, her voice softening, I am not the person I was when I got off that stagecoach. That person is gone. I don't know who I am now, but I know one thing. I will not let Gerald Morrison win. He looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of a smile in his dark eyes. It was a small, grim thing, but it was there. All right, partner, he said. Let's go hunt a dragon. The next morning, they walked into the Cedar Ridge Depot. The air smelled of coal smoke and old paper. Albert, the station agent, was a thin, nervous man with eyes that constantly darted toward the door, as if he expected trouble at any moment. He paled when he saw Samuel and Catherine approach his counter. Mr. Hayes, ma'am, he stammered, avoiding their eyes. Albert, Samuel began, his voice calm and steady. We need to talk to you about Tom Brennan. Albert flinched at the name. Tragic business, a real tragedy. We think it was more than a tragedy, Albert, Catherine said, her voice low but firm. We think it was murder, and we think you might know something that can help us prove it. The agent started sweating. I don't know anything, he said quickly, his voice high-pitched with fear. I just sell tickets. I handle the freight. That's all. What about the mail, Albert? Catherine pressed gently. Did Tom ever complain about his mail? Letters not arriving? Shipments being delayed? Albert's eyes widened. It was clear they had hit a nerve. He opened his mouth to deny it, but then he looked at Samuel's hard, determined face and at Catherine's steady, unwavering gaze. He saw something there that was perhaps, just perhaps, stronger than his fear of Morrison. He swallowed hard and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. Everyone has problems with the mail, he hissed. Everyone who gets in Morrison's way. Letters from banks vanish. Contracts get lost. Shipments of vital equipment get rerouted to the wrong state. This was it, the proof they needed. Can you prove it? Samuel asked, his voice tight with excitement. Albert hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door again. He looked like a cornered animal. Finally, he seemed to make a decision. With trembling hands, he reached under his counter and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. He slid it across the counter. For 2 years, he whispered, his voice shaking with a mixture of terror and defiance. I've kept a secret record. Every piece of mail that went missing, every delayed shipment, every complaint, the dates, the names, the destinations. It's all in here. Catherine opened the ledger. Her hands were shaking now, too. Page after page was filled with Albert's neat, spidery handwriting. It was a meticulous record of a criminal conspiracy. It was Morrison's entire campaign of sabotage, laid bare. Why? Catherine breathed, looking up at the terrified man. Why risk this? A flicker of anger, of long-suppressed rage showed in Albert's eyes. Because Tom Brennan was my friend, he said, his voice cracking. Because Jim Patterson, who tried to start a grain mill, was my cousin. Because I'm sick of watching a monster devour this town, piece by piece. He took a deep breath. Take it, use it. But if he finds out I helped you... He won't, Samuel said, his voice a promise. We're taking this to Denver, to the U.S. Marshals. When we come back, it will be with federal protection. For you and for everyone else in this town who's willing to stand up to him. As they turned to leave, the ledger tucked safely inside Catherine's satchel alongside the stolen money, Albert called out to them, his voice urgent. There's something else, he said. Be careful. Morrison has eyes and ears everywhere. He has a man, Jake, scar on his face. He's the one who enforces things. He was seen near Tom's ranch the night of the fire. It was more than a suspicion now. It was a direct link, a witness. They left the depot and walked back out into the deceptively peaceful sunshine of Cedar Ridge. The town looked the same, but for Catherine, everything had changed. The dusty street, the false-fronted buildings, the people going about their business, it was all a facade. Underneath, a war was brewing, and they had just found their secret weapon. As they passed the saloon, the doors swung open and two men stumbled out. One of them was the man Albert had just described. Tall, powerfully built, with a jagged white scar that pulled at the corner of his left eye. It was Jake. He saw them, his cold, dead eyes locked onto Catherine's satchel. He couldn't have known what was inside, but he knew they were a threat. A slow, menacing smile spread across his scarred face. He said something to his companion, and they both laughed. It was a promise of violence. Catherine's blood ran cold. The journey to Denver had just become a race for their lives. The train ride to Denver was 100 miles of nerve-shredding tension. Every shadow in the swaying passenger car looked like one of Morrison's men. Every stop in a small, dusty town felt like an ambush waiting to happen. Catherine clutched the satchel containing the ledger and the money to her chest, while Samuel sat across from her, his one hand never far from the heavy wrench he'd tucked into his belt. Denver was a shock to the system, a bustling, chaotic city teeming with life. It was a world away from the oppressive silence of Cedar Ridge. Here, Morrison was just a name, not a king. The territorial courthouse was an imposing granite building, a monument to the power of the law they were hoping to unleash. Their meeting was with Federal Marshal Robert Harrison, a man with a reputation for being tough, fair, and utterly incorruptible. Harrison was a tall, lean man with graying hair and eyes that had seen everything the frontier could throw at a man. He listened to their story without interruption, his face an unreadable mask. Catherine laid out the facts with the cool, logical precision she'd learned from her father, while Samuel provided the raw, emotional context of a man who had watched his friend be destroyed. When they were finished, Catherine placed Albert's ledger on the marshal's massive oak desk. "This is our proof, Marshal," she said. "A 2-year record of systematic mail fraud, all designed to ruin any potential competitor to Gerald Morrison." Harrison opened the ledger. He spent a long time studying the pages, his expression grim. "This is extensive," he said finally. He looked up at them, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "You understand the gravity of what you're alleging. You're not just accusing a man of mail fraud. You're accusing him of building a criminal empire, of corruption, of murder." "Yes, sir," Samuel said. "We do." "And you realize," Harrison continued, his voice low, "that if I open an investigation of this magnitude, I will be turning over every stone in Cedar Ridge County. That includes yours." He looked directly at Catherine. "Your finances, Mrs. Whitmore. Your reasons for being in Cedar Ridge. Everything will come to light. Are you prepared for that?" Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment she had been dreading. Her father's stolen money. If it was discovered, she could be charged as an accessory. The entire plan would collapse. She met the marshal's gaze without flinching. "I am prepared to face the consequences of my past, Marshal," she said, her voice steady. "But first, I need to see justice for the present." Harrison stared at her for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was as if she had passed some kind of test. "This ledger is compelling," he said, "but it's the word of one man, a terrified man by your account. To act, I need more. I need to bring in the Postal Inspection Service, and I need a second source, someone else willing to testify to Morrison's methods." Catherine and Samuel exchanged a look of frustration. They were so close. "Marshal," Samuel pleaded, "people are too afraid. Morrison has them all under his thumb." "Then you need to find a way to convince them," Harrison said, his tone final. "Find me one more credible witness who can corroborate this story of sabotage. You do that, and I will give you your investigation. I will bring the full force of the United States government down on Cedar Ridge." He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "But be warned, you've kicked the hornet's nest. Morrison will know you came to me. He will not wait for me to act. Go back to Cedar Ridge. Get me what I need. And for God's sake, watch your backs." They left the courthouse feeling a strange mixture of hope and terror. They had a path forward, but it led straight back into the lion's den. As they walked through the crowded Denver streets, Samuel turned to Catherine. "One more witness," he said, his voice heavy with doubt. "Who, Catherine? Who else would dare?" Catherine's mind was racing, sifting through the names, the stories, the victims. Jim Patterson, the grain mill owner, was gone, fled to Denver. Sarah Jenkins, the dressmaker, had been run out of town. Who was left? And then it hit her, a memory of her first day in Cedar Ridge, a detail she had overlooked. Martha Murphy, she said, at the hotel. When Morrison arrived, her face, she wasn't just scared, Samuel. She was horrified. It was personal. It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. That night, they took the train back to Cedar Ridge. As the train pulled out of the station, Samuel caught a glimpse of a man in the crowd, watching them from the shadows. A man with a jagged scar on his face. Jake. They were being followed. The hunt was on. The journey back was a waking nightmare. They knew Jake was on the train somewhere. They didn't see him, but they felt his presence, a cold weight in the air. Every stop was a potential attack. Every darkened window a threat. They arrived in Cedar Ridge just after dawn. The town looked peaceful, sleeping under a blanket of morning mist. But it was the peace of a graveyard. They went straight to the hotel. Martha Murphy was in the kitchen, kneading dough, her face etched with worry. She looked up when they came in, and her hands stilled. "He knows," she said, her voice a frightened whisper. "Morrison knows you went to Denver. He was here last night, asking questions about you." "Martha," Catherine said, getting straight to the point, "we met with the U.S. Marshals. They're willing to help, but we need more evidence. We need another witness." Martha shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No, I can't. He would destroy me." "He's going to destroy us all anyway, Martha," Samuel said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is our only chance, our last chance." "Why should I trust you?" Martha cried, her composure finally breaking. "You'll be gone, but I have to live here." Catherine reached into her satchel, but instead of the ledger, she pulled out a stack of banknotes, a thick, heavy stack. $5,000. She placed it on the flour-dusted table. "This is not a bribe, Martha," Catherine said softly. "This is a guarantee. This is enough money for you to leave Cedar Ridge, to start a new life anywhere you want, if this goes wrong. But I don't believe it will. We are going to win. We are going to take him down, but we cannot do it without you." Martha stared at the money, then at Catherine's face. She saw not a bribe, but a promise of a future free from fear. Tears welled in her eyes. "My husband," she began, her voice thick with a grief that was years old. "He didn't die of a fever, like the doctor said. He opposed Morrison at a town meeting. He wanted to form a cooperative so the ranchers could get a fair price for their cattle. A week later, he was dead." She took a shaky breath. "Morrison's man, Jake, paid a visit to the doctor the day before he signed the death certificate. I saw him. I heard them talking. They called it a persuasive conversation. It was the smoking gun, corruption of a town official, witness intimidation, a direct link between Morrison and a suspicious death." "Will you testify to that, Martha?" Catherine asked, her heart pounding. Martha looked at the money, then at the memory of her husband in her eyes. She pushed the money back across the table. "Keep your money," she said, her voice filled with a newfound strength. "I don't want a new life. I want my old one back. I want my town back." She stood up straighter. "Yes, I will testify." At that exact moment, the kitchen door burst open. Jake stood there, the scar on his face a livid white. In his hand, he held a revolver. It was pointed directly at Catherine. "The boss wants his ledger back," Jake snarled, "and he wants to have a word with the lady." Samuel moved so fast he was a blur. He threw himself at Catherine, knocking her and the table to the floor in a clatter of pans and flour. The gun roared, the sound deafening in the small kitchen. A bullet splintered the wall where Catherine's head had been a second before. Samuel rolled, coming up with a heavy wrench from his belt. Jake fired again, the shot going wild. Before he could fire a third time, Samuel brought the wrench down on Jake's gun hand with a sickening crunch of bone. Jake screamed, dropping the revolver. But he was a brute. He lunged forward, his good hand reaching for Samuel's throat. The two men crashed against the far wall, a whirlwind of desperate, savage violence. Catherine, covered in flour, scrambled for the fallen revolver. Her hands were shaking violently, but she gripped the heavy metal, forcing her finger into the trigger guard. Jake had Samuel pinned against the wall. His thumbs were pressing into Samuel's windpipe. Samuel's face was turning purple. "Get the marshal," Samuel choked out. Catherine knew there was no time. She raised the gun, the barrel trembling. "Get away from him," she screamed. Jake just laughed, a gurgling, triumphant sound. "You ain't got the guts, city girl." Something inside Catherine snapped. The fear, the desperation, the rage. It all coalesced into a single point of cold, clear focus. She thought of Tom Brennan, of Martha's husband, of all the lives this monster and his boss had destroyed. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. Jake's body jerked, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He staggered back, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He looked down at the wound, then up at Catherine, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then he collapsed to the floor and didn't move again. Silence. The kitchen was a wreck. Flour covered everything, looking like a fresh layer of snow. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Samuel slumped against the wall, gasping for air, rubbing the bruises on his neck. Martha was huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with shock. And Catherine stood in the middle of it all, the heavy revolver still smoking in her hand. The Boston socialite was well and truly gone. In her place was a woman who had just killed a man to save her partner. The sound of shouting and running feet came from the street. The gunshots had woken the entire town. "We have to go," Samuel gasped, getting to his feet. "Now, before the sheriff gets here." "The sheriff?" Catherine said, her mind numb. "Morrison's sheriff," Samuel reminded her. "He'll see a dead body and a woman holding a gun. He won't ask questions. He'll hang you." They had to get out of Cedar Ridge. They had to get to the next town, get a telegram to Marshal Harrison. They had the witness they needed, but now they were fugitives. They scrambled out the back door of the hotel just as a posse, led by the sheriff, burst in through the front. They ran through the back alleys of the town, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. They made it to the livery stable. Samuel saddled 2 horses with frantic speed. "Where do we go?" Catherine cried as she hauled herself into the saddle. "North," Samuel said, swinging up onto his own horse. "Into the mountains. It's the only place they won't be able to follow us easily." They galloped out of town, leaving the chaos behind them. As they crested the first hill, they looked back. Cedar Ridge was a hive of activity, with men on horseback fanning out, searching for them. They had won their witness, but in doing so, they had lost everything else. They were on the run, hunted for a murder they had committed in self-defense, with a posse led by a corrupt sheriff at their heels. Morrison had played his hand. Now they were playing for their lives. The mountains were a harsh and unforgiving wilderness. For 2 days they rode hard, pushing their horses and themselves to the brink of exhaustion. The posse was relentless, always a few hours behind, their pursuit guided by Morrison's knowledge of the land. They survived on what little food they had and the water from icy mountain streams. Catherine, who had once worried about scuffing her leather shoes, was now sleeping on pine needles, her face smudged with dirt, her body aching with a weariness she had never known. But she felt more alive than she ever had in her life. On the 3rd day, Samuel found a place to hide, an old abandoned line shack, tucked away in a narrow canyon, almost invisible from the trail. "We can rest here," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "Just for a night." Inside the cramped, dusty cabin, as a small fire pushed back the chilling darkness, the walls they had built around themselves finally came down. "Your arm," Catherine said softly. "It wasn't a ranching accident, was it?" Samuel stared into the flames, his face a mask of old pain. "No," he said quietly, "it wasn't." He told her the story. 5 years ago, he'd been a rancher himself, a small one, but successful. He'd been one of the first to see what Morrison was, and he'd tried to organize the other small ranchers against him, just like Martha's husband. "Morrison didn't want a martyr," Samuel said, his voice bitter. "He wanted a message." Jake and 2 other men had come to his ranch one night. They hadn't killed him. They had done something worse. They had tied him down and deliberately fed his arm into the gears of a post-hole digger while he was conscious. "They wanted everyone to see what happens when you cross Gerald Morrison," he finished, his voice barely a whisper. "After that, no one dared to stand against him again. I lost my ranch, my livelihood, my fight. Catherine finally understood the depth of the darkness in his eyes. It wasn't just grief for his friend, it was the pain of his own broken past. Until you showed up, he said, looking at her, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded emotion. You walked into my town with your fancy dress and your bag full of secrets, and you relit a fire I thought had gone out for good. He reached out and took her hand. His calloused palm was warm against hers. Catherine, I... But whatever he was about to say was cut off by the sound of a horse outside. They both froze. Samuel grabbed his wrench, and Catherine reached for the revolver, which had become a permanent fixture at her side. The cabin door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was not the sheriff, not Morrison's men. It was Marshal Harrison. Behind him stood 4 heavily armed deputies. Took us a while to track you down, Harrison said, his face grim. We got a telegram from Martha Murphy. She told us everything. The confession, the attack, the self-defense. He looked at the dead fire of the posse's last camp through the trees. We also paid a visit to your local sheriff. He's in custody, along with 3 of his so-called deputies, for conspiring to murder fugitives from federal justice. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled Catherine's knees washed over her. It was over. The running was over. It's time to end this, Harrison said. Morrison has holed himself up at his ranch. He knows we're coming. He's got maybe a dozen men with him. It's going to be a fight. We're coming with you, Samuel said, his voice hard as iron. I was hoping you'd say that, the marshal replied. They rode down from the mountains with the rising sun at their backs. A small army of lawmen, led by a Boston socialite and a one-armed blacksmith. Morrison's ranch was a fortress. His men were positioned on the roof behind barricades. The siege began. Gunfire echoed through the valley for hours. It was a brutal, bloody affair. Deputies fell. Morrison's men fell. In the midst of the chaos, Catherine saw her chance. While the main firefight was focused on the front of the house, she and Samuel circled around to the back. They found a cellar door unlocked. They moved through the quiet, opulent house like ghosts. It was a palace built on the suffering of others. They found Morrison in his study. He wasn't fighting. He was frantically trying to burn documents in the fireplace. Ledgers, deeds, letters, the paper trail of his entire criminal enterprise. He spun around when they entered, a pistol in his hand. His face was a mask of feral rage. He was no longer the calm, confident cattle baron. He was a cornered animal. You! He snarled, raising the pistol at Catherine. Samuel charged him, a wordless roar of fury. He took the first shot in his shoulder, the impact spinning him around, but he didn't stop. He crashed into Morrison, his one good arm wrapping around Morrison's throat, squeezing with all the rage and pain of the last 5 years. The 2 men struggled, crashing over the desk. Morrison's gun fired again, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling. Catherine saw the heavy iron poker by the fireplace. She grabbed it, her mind clear and cold. Morrison threw Samuel off him and raised the gun for a final, point-blank shot. Catherine swung the poker with all her strength. It connected with Morrison's wrist with a sharp crack. The gun flew from his hand. He stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and pain. In that moment, he saw his empire, his power, everything he had built, crumble at the hands of the woman he had dismissed as a city girl. The study doors burst open and Marshal Harrison and his deputies stormed in. It was over. Gerald Morrison, the king of Cedar Ridge, was led away in chains, a broken, defeated man. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Morrison's trial was a sensation. One by one, the people of Cedar Ridge, now free from fear, took the stand. Martha Murphy, Albert, the depot agent, a dozen other ranchers, farmers, and business owners who had been victimized over the years. The evidence was damning. Morrison was convicted on charges ranging from mail fraud and racketeering to conspiracy to commit murder. He would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. His corrupt empire was dismantled. His land and assets were seized by the government. Cedar Ridge was free, but a question remained. What would become of the town? That's where Catherine's real work began. The $47,000, the stolen money that had started it all, was no longer a secret burden. It was an opportunity. With Samuel at her side, she formed the Cedar Ridge Development Cooperative. Using her capital and with the backing of the federal government, they began to rebuild. They didn't just rebuild, they reinvented. They used the seized assets to compensate every family Morrison had ever wronged. Jim Patterson came back from Denver to run a new state-of-the-art grain mill, co-owned by the very farmers he served. The money flowed. It was laundered, not through crime, but through creation. It funded a sawmill, a new school, and a doctor's office. The town boomed. The railroad, seeing the explosion of freight, finally built the spur they had promised years ago. Cedar Ridge was reborn, not as a kingdom ruled by one man, but as a community built by many. One evening, a year after Morrison's arrest, Samuel took Catherine to the top of the hill overlooking the valley. The lights of the thriving town twinkled below. The blackened ruins of Tom's ranch were gone, replaced by the sprawling, successful cooperative mill. "You did this, Catherine," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. His arm was in a sling, but his eyes were clear and bright for the first time. "You brought this town back from the dead." "We did this," she corrected him softly. He turned to her. "I never told you the full truth about my arm," he said. "Losing it? It wasn't just the pain. It was the shame. He took my fight. He made me a symbol of his power. Every day for 5 years I woke up a broken man." He took her hand. "You gave me my fight back. You gave me my life back." He knelt awkwardly on one knee. "I know you came here to marry another man, and I know I'm not a prosperous rancher. I'm just a one-armed blacksmith. But Catherine Whitmore, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears streamed down Catherine's face as she looked at this incredible, resilient man. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, of course. Yes." Her redemption was complete. The stolen money had been transformed into a legacy of hope and prosperity. She had not only escaped her past, but she had remade it into something beautiful. The mail-order bride who had arrived with a bag full of secrets had found something she never expected. Not an escape, but a home. A life built not on lies, but on the hard-won truth that justice is always worth fighting for. And that even in the darkest of places, the most unlikely people can come together and build something that will last forever. If this story of justice and redemption moved you, there are 2 more incredible tales waiting for you right on your screen. Don't let the algorithm decide for you. Click on one and continue the journey. And before you go, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story from our channel. Thank you for watching.